Alright you guys, so today I'm going to show you how to do a Gixxer front end swap on a 1976 CB550. Now I'm not actually going to put the front end on right now, but I will show you guys how I center the front wheel onto the forks, because I think that's the hardest part. And actually putting the forks on is as simple as switching out the neck bearings. So these are the parts that I'm going to be using. The first item is this 19-inch Harley front wheel. It's going to be from a 2007 Street Bob, and it's going to have that hub that has the 1-inch bearing in it. Here's a set of Suzuki Gixxer 1000 forks. I got some standard brake calipers. I have these brake caliper spacers. They're 10 millimeters wide, and they're going to allow us to put on these larger Suzuki Hayabusa rotors, which are 320 millimeters in diameter. Here are the steering bearings that are going to allow us to put the fork onto the actual bike. Here's the part numbers. This is just the axle for the front end. This is the bearing sleeve that goes inside the hub. Here are the 25 millimeter bearings. These are bearing spacers, and I'm going to show you why I'm using these. They're Harley Davidson rear wheel bearing spacers. And then these are just the bearing seals. Okay, so first we're going to start off by putting together the front wheel. Now this front wheel is from a 2007 Street Bob, and it's going to have a front hub that uses a 1-inch bearing standard. Now we're going to be switching out this 1-inch bearing to a 25 millimeter bearing. Now the problem is that this 1-inch bearing is a lot thicker than this 25 millimeter bearing. So what we're going to do is we're going to use one of these Harley bearing spacers, and we're going to install it with the 25 millimeter bearing, and as you can see it's pretty much the same thickness now. So how we're going to put all this together is we're going to put in this bearing sleeve, followed by the spacer, and then we're going to press in the bearing, and we're going to do that on both sides. So once everything's installed, basically you're going to have this sleeve followed by the spacers and then the bearings, and then we're going to have the seals on the ends. And that's what the inside of the bearing or the hub should look like. Alright, so now that we have these bearings in the hub, it's time to put these rotors onto the wheel. Now what we need to figure out is how to put this Harley bolt pattern onto here. So what I did was, this wheel came with this cover, and I basically took this cover and I centered it on the rotor, and I drilled my bolt pattern that way. So with it drilled, it actually fits perfectly on there. Just like that. And we're going to go ahead and just bolt them in and test fit this wheel. Okay, so we have the rotors on the wheel, we have the calipers on the forks, we also have the little caliper spacers. I have everything just kind of leaned up against the wall, and I'm going to go ahead and put the axle in, and I'll kind of show you what kind of spacing we have in the axle. Okay, so we have the wheel and the forks. I have it centered as best as possible. What I did was I took that brake rotor and I centered it in the middle of the caliper on both sides. So what we got going on is this little gap right here between the fork and the axle nut. Now this axle nut needs to sit flush with the fork. So I'm going to take this distance, I'm going to remove it from the end of the nut, and after that this should sit flush and the wheel should be centered. So I'm going to go ahead and take that measurement. I'm getting around 3.25 millimeters. So that's how much I'm going to machine off of this nut. I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. Okay, so I have an extra axle nut to show you the difference. This is the one where I shaved off 3.25 millimeters off the end. You could see the difference there. So I'm going to go ahead and put this one back on the bike, and the wheel should be centered and this should be flush against the fork. Okay, so we have the axle nut back on the forks. As you can see, it's sitting flush with the forks now. The wheel is still centered, and what I'm noticing is that the axle is not gripping all the threads inside that axle nut. So I'm going to remove some of the steel off of here so that the axle can grip more of the threads within here. Okay, so to figure out how much to remove here, I'm going to take the measurement from outside bearing to outside bearing, and I'm going to take the measurement from this edge to this edge, and I'm going to subtract them from one another. Okay, so taking my measurement from outside bearing to outside bearing, I'm getting 135 millimeters. Okay, so now taking my measurement from edge to edge, I'm getting 129.42 millimeters. Alright, so I drew this up to show you guys what's going on. Basically, the hub is 135 millimeters wide. The axle width from inside to inside is 129.42 millimeters wide. So the hub's a lot bigger than the axle. So the red is going to show you the axle, the green is going to show you the hub, and this is how much we need to remove from that axle, from this part right here. So what I did was I subtracted the hub from the axle, and I'm getting roughly 0.22 inches to machine off the edge of here. So let me show you the difference now. Okay, so here is the modified axle, and here is an original axle. This is where I took 3.25 millimeters off this end, and this is where I took 0.22 inches off of this end. And you can definitely see the difference there. So when I put this new axle on, it should all fit perfectly, and the wheel should be flush within the forks. Okay, so now we have the wheel and the new machine axle back on the forks. You can see that the axle nut is still flush with the edge of the fork. The wheel is still centered within the brake calipers. And even though the axle nut is a little bit inside the fork, it shouldn't create any problems. All we have to do now is just install the neck bearings and install it on the bike, and we should be done.